The emergency bay of Meridian General Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos that Dr. Elena Vasquez had learned to navigate over her 15 years as chief of trauma surgery. Banks of holographic displays showed vital signs, surgical schedules, and patient data streaming in real time from across the medical complex. The soft hum of anti-grav stretchers and the whispered conversations of medical staff created a symphony she knew by heart. But today, something was different. Today, the weight of impossible decisions pressed down on her shoulders like a gravitational field she couldn't escape. The crisis had begun 3 weeks ago when the first patients arrived from the Kepler 442b mining colony. What started as a routine bacterial infection had evolved into something that defied every known treatment protocol. The pathogen, designated X7 by the Centers for Disease Control, adapted faster than their most advanced pharmaceutical AI could develop countermeasures. It was as if the microorganism possessed an intelligence of its own, learning from each treatment attempt and developing resistance in real time. Elena stood before the massive curved window of her office, watching the sprawling cityscape of New Geneva stretch toward the horizon. The city's gleaming towers and transport tubes represented humanity's triumph over adversity, their expansion beyond Earth a testament to the species' resilience. But now, as reports flooded in from 17 different star systems, that resilience was being tested in ways that challenged everything she thought she knew about medicine. The door chimed softly, and Dr. Marcus Webb, her chief of staff, entered with a grim expression. His usually pristine appearance showed signs of strain, rumpled scrubs, tired eyes, and the slight tremor in his hands that came from too many stimulants and too little sleep. "Elena, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. She turned from the window, already knowing what he was going to say. The latest treatment protocol had failed. Patient 47, a young engineer from the Titan orbital platform, had succumbed to the infection despite receiving the most advanced care their medical technology could provide. The pathogen had not only resisted their latest antimicrobial cocktail but had actually seemed to thrive on it, multiplying at an exponential rate that defied biological logic. "How many?" Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. 17 confirmed deaths in the last 6 hours, Marcus replied, sinking into the chair across from her desk. "The infection is spreading faster than our containment protocols can handle. We're looking at a potential pandemic scenario that could affect every human settlement from here to the Andromeda relay stations." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion over the past weeks. She had dedicated her life to healing, to pushing the boundaries of what medical science could achieve. Her innovations in nanosurgical techniques had saved thousands of lives. Her research into genetic therapies had opened new frontiers in treating previously incurable diseases. But this pathogen, this thing, seemed to mock every advancement humanity had made. The holographic display on her desk flickered to life, showing the latest epidemiological models. Red zones spread across the star map like drops of blood in water, each representing a system where X7 had established a foothold. The projections were stark and unforgiving. Within 6 months, the infection could reach Earth itself. Within a year, human civilization as they knew it could collapse. "The board is calling for a complete quarantine protocol," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to seal off the affected systems, write them off as acceptable losses." Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Acceptable losses. As if the hundreds of thousands of people in those systems were simply numbers on a spreadsheet rather than lives with stories, dreams, and loved ones waiting for them to come home. "That's not medicine," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "That's surrender." "It's pragmatism," Marcus countered, though his heart didn't seem to be in the argument. "Elena, we've tried everything. Every treatment, every experimental protocol, every theoretical approach our best minds can conceive. The pathogen adapts faster than we can develop countermeasures. At some point, we have to accept that we're fighting a losing battle." The words hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Elena had heard variations of this conversation from her staff, from the hospital board, from the government officials who called her office at all hours demanding answers she didn't have. The pressure to give up, to accept defeat, came from every direction. But something deep within her rebelled against that inevitability. She thought of Dr. Sarah Chen, a young resident who had volunteered to work in the isolation wards despite the risks. Sarah's grandfather had been one of the pioneers who established the first colonies beyond Earth, facing impossible odds with nothing but determination and ingenuity. That same spirit lived in Sarah, in the nurses who worked double shifts without complaint, in the researchers who hadn't left their labs in days. It was the spirit that had carried humanity from cave paintings to starships, from tribal medicine to technologies that could rebuild a person at the cellular level. There has to be something we're missing, Elena said, moving to her personal workstation. The holographic interface responded to her touch, displaying patient files, research data, and treatment outcomes in a complex three-dimensional matrix. Some pattern, some vulnerability we haven't identified. Marcus shook his head. Elena, I know what you're thinking, but do you? She interrupted, her fingers dancing across the interface as she pulled up the genetic sequencing data from the latest pathogen samples. Because what I'm thinking is that we've been approaching this like traditional infectious disease specialists. We've been trying to kill it, to overwhelm it with conventional treatments. But what if that's exactly the wrong approach? The data streams flowed around her like a digital river, each sequence representing another mystery to unravel. The pathogen's genetic structure was unlike anything in their databases, not quite bacterial, not quite viral, but something that seemed to occupy a space between categories. Its replication rate was astronomical, but more disturbing was its ability to rewrite its own genetic code in response to environmental pressures. Look at this, Elena said, highlighting a particular sequence strand. The pathogen doesn't just develop resistance, it actively incorporates elements of whatever we use against it. It's not just adapting, it's learning. Marcus leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. That's impossible. Microorganisms don't have cognitive capabilities. Don't they? Elena pulled up comparative data from Earth's own evolutionary history. Consider the intelligence of slime molds, the problem-solving abilities of bacterial colonies, the way viruses can hijack cellular machinery. We've been so focused on the individual pathogen that we haven't considered the possibility that we're dealing with a collective intelligence. The implications of her theory sent a chill through the room. If the pathogen possessed some form of distributed consciousness, if it could learn and adapt not just biologically but strategically, then humanity was facing an adversary unlike any they had ever encountered. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Even if you're right, even if this thing has some kind of intelligence, what does that change? We still can't develop treatments faster than it can adapt to them. It changes everything, Elena replied, her mind racing with possibilities. If it's intelligent, then it has motivations, goals, perhaps even weaknesses that have nothing to do with biology. We've been fighting a war with medical weapons when we should have been trying to understand what it wants. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent chime from Elena's communication system. Dr. Chen's face appeared on the holographic display, her protective suit's helmet framing her worried features. Behind her, the isolation ward hummed with activity as medical staff tended to patients in various stages of infection. Dr. Vasquez, Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. We have a situation in Ward 7. Patient 23, the asteroid miner from Ceres, he's showing unprecedented improvement. His immune response has completely shifted, and the pathogen levels in his bloodstream are dropping rapidly. Elena's heart raced. A spontaneous recovery was exactly the kind of breakthrough they needed, but it also raised troubling questions. What changed? What's different about his treatment protocol? That's just it, Sarah replied, glancing at her tablet. He hasn't received any treatment in the last 18 hours. His phore got disconnected during a power fluctuation, and we've been so overwhelmed that we didn't notice until this morning. He should be dead, but instead he's getting better. Elena and Marcus exchanged glances. If a patient was recovering without treatment, it meant either his immune system had found a way to fight the pathogen naturally, or something else was happening, something they didn't understand. I'm coming down, Elena said, already moving toward her office door. Sarah, don't do anything different. Don't restart any treatments. I want to observe his condition directly. As they made their way through the hospital's corridors, Elena's mind churned with possibilities. The asteroid miner's recovery could be a fluke, a genetic anomaly, or it could represent the key to everything. If his immune system had found a way to communicate with the pathogen, to reach some kind of biological détente, then, perhaps the solution wasn't to destroy the infection but to understand it. The isolation ward was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. Here, the usual bustle was replaced by an almost reverent quiet, broken only by the whisper of air recyclers and the soft beeping of monitoring equipment. Patients lay in transparent containment fields, their bodies fighting a battle that medical science couldn't help them win. Patient 23, whose chart identified him as Thomas Kellerman, age 34, asteroid mining specialist, sat up in his bed, looking better than anyone infected with X7 had a right to. His color was good, his breathing steady, and the telltale lesions that marked the infection's progress had faded to barely visible scars. "Thomas," Elena said, activating the communication system. "I'm Dr. Vasquez, Chief of Trauma Surgery. How are you feeling?" Thomas looked up with clear eyes, a stark contrast to the fevered delirium that characterized the infection's progression. "Better than I have in weeks, doctor. I know this sounds crazy, but I feel like I've been having conversations." "Conversations?" Elena's pulse quickened. "With whom?" "That's the thing," Thomas said, running a hand through his hair. "Not with people. With something else. In my dreams, maybe? Or when I was unconscious. I can't really describe it, but it was like there was something trying to tell me something. Something important." Elena's theoretical framework suddenly clicked into place. If the pathogen was indeed intelligent, if it had been trying to communicate rather than simply replicate, then Thomas might have been the first human to successfully establish contact. The implications were staggering, not just for treating the infection, but for humanity's understanding of intelligence itself. Marcus shook his head skeptically. "Elena, you're not seriously considering that this man was talking to a microorganism?" But Elena was already pulling up Thomas's neural activity scans from the previous night. The patterns were unlike anything she had seen in X7 patients. Instead of the chaotic spikes that indicated brain inflammation, there were regular, almost rhythmic waves that resembled nothing so much as a conversation. "Thomas," she said, leaning closer to the communication panel, "I need you to think very carefully. During these conversations, did you get any sense of what this presence wanted?" Thomas closed his eyes, his face scrunched in concentration. "It wasn't malicious," he said finally. "Confused, maybe. Lost. Like it didn't understand where it was or how it got here. And it was hungry. Not for food, but for something else. Information, maybe? Understanding?" Elena's mind raced. An intelligence pathogen that was confused and seeking understanding. It painted a picture not of a weapon or plague, but of something trying to survive in an environment it didn't comprehend. Perhaps the deaths, the rapid replication, the apparent aggression were not attacks but desperate attempts at communication. "Dr. Vasquez," Sarah interrupted, her voice urgent. "I'm getting reports from other wards. 3 more patients are showing similar recovery patterns, all of them mining specialists or deep space workers. All of them report having dreams about conversations with an unknown presence." The pattern was emerging. The patients who were recovering weren't the strongest or the youngest, they were individuals who had spent significant time in the deep void of space, isolated from Earth's biosphere, accustomed to encountering the unknown. Perhaps their psychological flexibility, their comfort with the alien, made them better candidates for establishing communication with the pathogen. Elena made a decision that would have horrified the medical board, violated every safety protocol, and potentially ended her career. "Sarah, I want you to arrange for direct neural interface monitoring for all recovering patients. And I want to volunteer for controlled exposure to the pathogen." The room fell silent. Marcus grabbed her arm. "Elena, that's suicide." "You can't." "I can and I will," she said firmly. "If this pathogen is intelligent, if it's trying to communicate, then someone needs to meet it halfway. Someone needs to listen." She looked around the room at the faces of her staff, some horrified, others intrigued, all of them recognizing the magnitude of what she was proposing. It was the kind of decision that separated true healers from those who merely practiced medicine by rote. It was the difference between giving up and finding a way forward, no matter how impossible it seemed. "But, Elena," Marcus said, his voice pleading, "even if you're right, even if you can establish some kind of communication, what makes you think you'll survive the process?" Elena smiled grimly. "Because, Marcus, I'm going to destroy the part of myself that's afraid to try." Part 2. The conversation. The quarantine chamber was smaller than Elena had imagined, a sterile white cube lined with monitoring equipment and sealed behind 3 layers of containment barriers. As she settled into the observation chair, electrodes attached to her skull and throat, she tried to quiet the voice in her head that screamed this was madness. The rational part of her mind, the part that had guided her through medical school and decades of careful, evidence-based practice, rebelled against what she was about to do. Dr. Sarah Chen monitored the preparation from outside the chamber, her hands steady as she calibrated the neural interface equipment. The modified array would record Elena's brainwave patterns while simultaneously allowing her to maintain conscious control during exposure to the pathogen. It was experimental technology, approved for this use only because the situation had moved beyond conventional protocols. "Neural interface online," Sarah announced through the communication system. "Elena, you need to know, we've identified 17 distinct pattern variations in the recovering patient's brain scans. Whatever communication is happening, it's not simple. We're looking at complex information exchange." Elena nodded, watching through the transparent barrier as a robotic arm prepared the controlled dose of X7. The pathogen sample glowed with an unsettling phosphorescence under the specialized lighting, as if it were more than mere biological matter. Recent analysis had revealed quantum-level structures within its genetic matrix, patterns that suggested information processing capabilities far beyond conventional microorganisms. Marcus paced outside the chamber like a caged animal. "Elena, it's not too late to reconsider. We could try computer simulation, artificial intelligence interfaces." "No," Elena replied firmly. "This requires human consciousness, human intuition. If the pathogen has been trying to communicate, it's been trying to reach minds like ours, not artificial constructs." The exposure protocol was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. A microscopic amount of X7 suspended in neural conductive fluid would be introduced through direct injection into her temporal cortex, the region of the brain associated with language processing and pattern recognition. If her theory was correct, if the pathogen was indeed attempting communication rather than mere replication, the modified neural interface would allow her to maintain awareness during the interaction. "Initiating exposure sequence," Sarah announced, her voice tight with concern. Elena felt the slight pressure of the injection, followed by a spreading warmth that seemed to flow along her neural pathways. For a moment, nothing happened. The monitoring equipment hummed quietly, displaying her vital signs in steady, reassuring patterns. Then, gradually, she became aware of something else, a presence at the edge of her consciousness, tentative and curious. The first contact was not words or images but pure sensation, a sense of vast loneliness, of intelligence adrift in an incomprehensible environment. Elena focused on projecting calm, openness, the mental equivalent of extending an open hand to a frightened animal. The presence responded, growing stronger, more defined. Where? The concept arrived not as a word but as a fundamental question, carrying with it layers of confusion and displacement. Elena tried to project concepts of location, of the hospital, of the planet they orbited. In return, she received impressions of vast emptiness, of drifting through void for eons, of searching for something it could no longer remember. Lost, came the next communication, accompanied by images that defied description, geometries that folded back on themselves, spaces that existed between dimensions, the sensation of falling through layers of reality. Elena's heart raced as understanding began to dawn. The pathogen wasn't from any known star system or planet. It had come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere outside conventional spacetime, where the rules of biology and physics operated differently. Who are you? Elena projected, trying to maintain focus despite the overwhelming nature of the contact. The answer came as a flood of sensations and half-formed concepts. The entity, for that's what it was, not merely a pathogen but a being of some kind, had once been part of something larger, a collective consciousness that existed in dimensional spaces beyond human comprehension. It had become separated, cast out into the physical universe where it struggled to survive using the only tools at its disposal: rapid adaptation and desperate attempts at communication. Hungry, it projected, but Elena now understood that its hunger wasn't for flesh or cellular material. It was starving for connection, for understanding, for the complex information patterns that constituted thought and emotion. "Elena," Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Your neural activity is off the charts. We're seeing patterns we've never recorded in human brains before." Elena tried to respond but found her voice trapped in her throat. The entity's presence was growing stronger, more integrated with her own consciousness. She could feel it exploring her memories, her knowledge, her understanding of the universe. But, rather than parasitic invasion, it felt like collaboration, two minds sharing perspectives across an impossible gulf of biology and physics. "Help," the entity projected, and, with that plea came images of the chaos it had caused. It had tried to communicate through the only mechanism available to it: direct integration with human biology. But human immune systems interpreted its presence as an attack, triggering responses that led to the very deaths it was trying to prevent. Elena projected understanding, sympathy, and a question: "What do you need?" The answer was complex, involving concepts that strained human language. The entity needed a bridge, a way to communicate with humans without triggering biological warfare. It needed to understand human physiology well enough to interact safely. Most importantly, it needed to find others like itself, the collective from which it had been separated. "Can you help?" Elena projected. The entity's response carried overwhelming gratitude and hope. It began sharing information not just about its own nature, but about the dimensional spaces it came from, about forms of consciousness and intelligence that existed beyond physical matter. Elena felt her understanding of the universe expanding, her conception of life itself being rewritten. But the exchange was taking its toll. She could feel her human consciousness being pushed to its limits, stretched thin by contact with an intelligence that operated on fundamentally different principles. Her vital signs were fluctuating wildly, and she could hear alarm tones from the monitoring equipment. "Must share," the entity projected urgently. "Others coming. Danger." Elena's blood turned cold. Others? More entities like this one, lost and confused, trying to communicate through destructive biological integration? The current crisis could be just the beginning. With tremendous effort, she projected a final concept: work together. The entity's response was immediate and overwhelming, a surge of agreement, hope, and desperate relief. But the intensity of the connection was too much for human neurology to sustain. Elena felt her consciousness fragmenting, her sense of self dissolving into the vastness of the entity's alien perspective. "Elena!" Marcus's voice cut through the dimensional static. "We're losing her. Sarah, initiate emergency disconnection." But Elena wasn't lost, she was transforming. The entity had shared not just information but aspects of its own consciousness, downloading knowledge and capabilities that human minds weren't designed to contain. She could feel her neural pathways restructuring themselves, adapting to accommodate forms of perception and processing that had never existed in baseline humanity. The disconnection came like a physical shock, severing the link and leaving Elena gasping in the sudden silence of her own thoughts. But the knowledge remained: alien perspectives on physics and biology, understanding of dimensional mathematics that made faster-than-light communication possible, and, most crucially, protocols for safe interface between human consciousness and entities from other dimensional spaces. "Elena!" Sarah was at her side as the containment barriers lifted. "Are you all right? Your neural patterns completely reorganized. We recorded 17 minutes of brain activity that shouldn't be possible in human neurology." Elena sat up slowly, her perception of the world around her fundamentally altered. Colors seemed more vivid, patterns more complex, and she could sense electromagnetic fields from the hospital's equipment like a gentle whisper against her consciousness. The entity had left her changed at the deepest level, evolved beyond baseline humanity while remaining essentially herself. "I'm fine," she said, though she knew she was anything but better than fine. "I understand now." Marcus approached cautiously, medical scanner in hand.
Elena, we need to run complete neurological diagnostics. What you've just experienced, it's unprecedented. We don't know what long-term effects, Elena interrupted, are exactly what we need.
She stood up, steadier than she had felt in weeks. The entity, we've been calling it X7, but its true designation is something like seeking mind from far place. It's not a pathogen.
It's a refugee. And it's not alone.
She moved to the holographic display, her enhanced perception allowing her to process the data streams with unprecedented clarity. There are others coming, entities from damaged or collapsed dimensional spaces, seeking new homes, new forms of existence.
They don't understand our biology, our psychology. When they try to communicate, our immune systems interpret their presence as an attack. Sarah pulled up the latest epidemiological reports.
If more are coming, we need to prepare containment protocols, evacuation procedures. No, Elena said firmly.
We need to prepare welcome protocols. These entities aren't invaders, they're refugees from a cosmic catastrophe we can't even imagine.
The deaths, the destruction, it's all miscommunication. They're trying to talk to us, and we're trying to kill them.
Marcus shook his head. Elena, even if you're right, how do we communicate safely?
Your exposure nearly killed you, and you only survived because of experimental neural interfaces. Elena smiled, feeling the altered structures in her brain processing information in ways that would have been impossible just hours before. We don't need to expose others to what I went through. The entity shared something with me, protocols for building translation devices, interfaces that can bridge the gap between human consciousness and dimensional entities without biological integration. She moved to the workstation, her fingers flying across the holographic interface as she began accessing manufacturing databases and engineering specifications. The knowledge the entity had shared included not just theoretical understanding but practical applications, blueprints for devices that could facilitate communication across dimensional boundaries.
Sarah, I need you to contact Dr. Yang in the theoretical physics department.
Tell him we need to fabricate quantum resonance arrays using crystal and matrix substrates. Marcus, get me a direct line to the mining colonies. We need volunteers, people who've spent time in deep space, individuals with the psychological flexibility to serve as communication intermediaries.
The next several hours passed in a blur of frantic activity.
Elena's enhanced perception allowed her to coordinate multiple research streams simultaneously, her consciousness processing information at speeds that amazed her colleagues.
The translation devices took shape rapidly, combining human engineering with alien principles to create something entirely new.
The first successful test came when they established contact with patient 23, Thomas Kellerman, the asteroid miner who had been among the first to recover. The translation device, a crystalline headset that interfaced with both human neural patterns and dimensional entity consciousness, allowed Thomas to communicate directly with the entity without biological integration. It's incredible, Thomas reported, his voice filled with wonder. It's like talking to someone who's been alone in the dark for thousands of years, and, suddenly, they can see light again.
It's grateful not just to be understood, but to understand us in return.
Elena monitored the communication through the hospital's neural network, her enhanced consciousness allowing her to perceive both sides of the conversation. The entity was sharing its story, how its home dimension had collapsed due to some cosmic catastrophe, how it and others like it had been cast into the physical universe as refugees seeking new forms of existence. But, more importantly, it was learning about humanity, about their biology, psychology, and social structures. The knowledge exchange was mutual and beneficial, with the entity sharing insights into dimensional physics that could revolutionize human technology while learning how to interact safely with biological organisms.
Dr. Vasquez, Sarah announced, we're receiving reports from 17 different star systems.
The translation devices are working.
Entities are making peaceful contact, sharing information, and the death rates have dropped to 0.
Elena felt a profound sense of satisfaction, but also recognition that this was just the beginning. Humanity had made first contact not with aliens from distant stars, but with refugees from damaged dimensions, beings whose very existence challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness and reality.
There's something else, Thomas reported through the translation device.
The entity says there are others still coming, not just more refugees like itself, but predators.
Beings that feed on consciousness, on dimensional energy. The refugees are fleeing from them, and they're heading this way. Elena's enhanced perception immediately grasped the implications.
Humanity had just learned to communicate with dimensional refugees, but now they faced the prospect of contact with entities that viewed consciousness as a food source. The current crisis had been resolved, but a greater challenge was approaching.
How long do we have? Elena asked.
Thomas consulted with the entity, their conversation facilitated by the translation device's quantum resonance patterns.
Maybe 6 months, maybe less. The predators follow the refugees' trail, consuming dimensional energy wherever they find it. Earth's biosphere, with billions of conscious minds, would be like a banquet to them.
Elena felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. But, this time, she wasn't facing it alone. She had been changed by contact with an alien intelligence, evolved beyond baseline humanity while retaining her essential self. She had successfully bridged the gap between species separated by dimensional barriers. "Then, we have work to do," she said, turning to her staff with renewed determination. 6 months to prepare for contact with entities that view consciousness as prey. 6 months to build defenses, to forge alliances with the refugees, to evolve our understanding of what it means to be alive in a universe far stranger than we ever imagined. As she looked around the room at her colleagues, scientists, doctors, and researchers who had just witnessed the impossible become routine, Elena realized that humanity itself was beginning to evolve. The weak, fearful species that had cowered before the unknown was being replaced by something stronger, more adaptable, more capable of facing whatever challenges the universe might present. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, and Elena had just discovered that this principle applied not just to individuals, but to entire species. Part 3, The Evolution Wars. The assembly hall beneath Geneva's diplomatic quarter had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. Representatives from 17 star systems sat alongside beings that existed primarily as patterns of organized energy, their consciousness housed in the crystalline translation matrices that had become humanity's first successful xenotechnology. Elena stood at the center of the curved amphitheater, her enhanced neurology allowing her to process the multiple conversation streams flowing between humans and dimensional refugees. 6 months had passed since first contact, and the changes to human society had been profound. The translation technology had evolved rapidly, guided by insights from the refugee entities that now called themselves the displaced. Entire research institutions had been transformed into hybrid consciousness labs where human and alien minds worked together on problems that neither could solve alone. But the approaching crisis cast a shadow over every achievement. The devourers, as the displaced called the predatory entities pursuing them, represented a form of consciousness that viewed other minds as consumable resources. Unlike the refugees, who had fled their dying dimension seeking coexistence, the devourers actively hunted conscious beings across dimensional boundaries. The latest deep space monitoring stations confirm it, reported Admiral Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to head of the new Dimensional Defense Initiative. "We're detecting reality distortions at the edge of the Oort cloud. The devourers have found our dimensional coordinates." Elena processed the tactical data through her enhanced consciousness, simultaneously consulting with 3 different displaced entities about defensive strategies. The aliens' perspective on physics and warfare operated on principles that challenged human understanding. Battles fought not just with energy weapons and physical shields, but with competing patterns of organized consciousness. Dr. Marcus Webb, now director of the Enhanced Human Integration Program, stood to address the assembly. His own neurology had been modified through controlled exposure to displaced knowledge, though not to the extent of Elena's transformation. "We've successfully integrated consciousness enhancement protocols with 47,000 volunteers from across human space," he reported. "The enhanced individuals show increased pattern recognition, improved dimensional awareness, and, most importantly, resistance to consciousness predation." Elena smiled grimly at the clinical terminology. Enhanced humans, individuals who had undergone controlled neural modification to interface directly with dimensional physics, represented humanity's first line of defense against entities that attacked minds rather than bodies. But the process was dangerous, with a failure rate that made it unsuitable for mass deployment. The question, said President Walsh, Earth's representative to the expanded Global Council, is whether 47,000 enhanced individuals can defend a population of 8 billion humans spread across 17 star systems. The answer came from Seeking Mind from Farplace, the refugee entity that had first contacted Elena. Its consciousness flowed through the translation matrix with patterns of light that conveyed complex meanings. Numbers are not the answer.
Evolution is the answer.
Species that survive devourers become more than they were.
Elena translated for those who couldn't interface directly with the alien communication.
The displaced have encountered devourer attacks before. Species that survive don't do so by hiding or fighting with conventional weapons. They survive by becoming something the devourers can't consume, by evolving beyond the forms of consciousness that serve as prey.
The implications were staggering.
Humanity would need to undergo fundamental changes not just in technology or society, but in the basic nature of human consciousness itself. The enhanced individuals were just the beginning, a prototype for what the entire species might need to become. What kind of evolution are we talking about? Asked Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the lead researcher in consciousness studies at the Tokyo Dimensional Institute.
Neural modification, genetic engineering, or something more fundamental?
Elena consulted with the displaced collective, her enhanced consciousness navigating the complex information structures of their group mind.
The answer was both more and less than human science had imagined.
The devourers feed on individual consciousness, she explained.
They're adapted to hunt minds that operate as discrete, isolated entities.
But consciousness can be organized differently as collective networks, as distributed patterns, as forms of awareness that exist between individual minds rather than within them.
Admiral Chan leaned forward. You're talking about a hive mind.
No, Elena corrected, something more sophisticated. A collective consciousness that preserves individual identity while creating something larger, a form of awareness that exists at multiple scales simultaneously. The displaced achieved this transformation in their home dimension. It's why they survived the collapse that destroyed their original form.
The room fell silent as the full magnitude of what she was suggesting became clear.
Humanity would need to abandon its conception of consciousness as fundamentally individual, embracing instead a form of collective awareness that could defend itself against predatory entities from other dimensions.
Marcus voiced what everyone was thinking. Elena, we're talking about changing what it means to be human.
The psychological barriers alone, people won't accept this kind of modification willingly. They will, Elena replied with certainty that surprised even her, when the alternative is extinction. The debate that followed consumed the next 18 hours, with representatives arguing the ethical implications of mandatory consciousness evolution while monitoring stations tracked the approaching devourer fleet. The reality distortions were growing stronger, and the first scout entities had already penetrated the outer solar system's dimensional barriers. Elena found herself caught between her role as humanity's primary interface with the displaced and her growing awareness that traditional human perspectives were becoming inadequate for the challenges they faced. Her enhanced consciousness could perceive layers of reality that remained invisible to baseline humans, and she could feel the approaching devourers like a cold wind at the edge of perception. The breakthrough came when Thomas Kellerman, the asteroid miner who had been among the first to establish communication with the displaced, volunteered for the next phase of enhancement. His consciousness had already been partially adapted through his early contact with Seeking Mind from Farplace, making him an ideal candidate for deeper integration. The procedure took place in a specially constructed chamber that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensional substrates where the displaced could operate more freely. Elena monitored Thomas's transformation as his individual consciousness gradually expanded to encompass connections with both human and alien minds. I can feel them, Thomas reported as the enhancement protocols took hold. Not just the displaced, but other humans who've undergone the process. We're not losing our individuality, we're gaining the ability to exist as both individuals and as part of something larger.
The sensation was unlike anything in human experience.
Thomas remained himself, his memories, personality, and core identity unchanged. But he could now access a level of consciousness that connected him to the growing network of enhanced individuals. He could think as Thomas Kellerman or as part of the collective entity that humanity was becoming. The devourers, he continued, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested multidimensional awareness, they can't consume this form of consciousness because it doesn't exist in any single location. They're adapted to hunt individual minds, but collective consciousness appears to them as empty space.
Elena felt a surge of hope.
The defensive strategy was working not by making humanity stronger in conventional terms, but by transforming the species into something the devourers couldn't perceive as prey.
But time was running short.
The reality distortions at the edge of the solar system indicated that the main devourer force would arrive within days.
The decision to implement emergency consciousness evolution protocols came from the Global Council with surprising unanimity. Faced with extinction, humanity chose transformation.
Mass production facilities across 17 star systems began manufacturing consciousness enhancement matrices, while volunteers by the millions lined up for procedures that would fundamentally alter the nature of human awareness. Elena coordinated the process through her enhanced consciousness, simultaneously managing logistics on an interstellar scale while consulting with displaced entities about optimization strategies. The transformation wasn't uniform. Some humans proved more adaptable to collective consciousness than others, and different communities developed variations on the basic enhancement patterns. But, as the Devourer fleet entered the inner solar system, humanity was no longer the same species that had first encountered X7 in the mining colonies. 8 billion individual minds had become something new, a collective consciousness that operated at multiple scales, from individual awareness through local community networks up to planet-wide and, eventually system-wide levels of organized thought. The first direct contact with the Devourers came when scout entities attempted to probe Earth's consciousness signatures. Elena, now serving as humanity's primary interface with dimensional entities of all types, felt the alien predators' confusion as they encountered minds that didn't conform to their hunting patterns. The Devourers were ancient and powerful, their consciousness adapted for feeding on individual awareness. But, when they attempted to attack human minds, they found themselves grasping at connections rather than discrete entities. The collective consciousness that humanity had become appeared to them as empty space, not because humans had hidden themselves, but because they had evolved beyond the form of awareness that served as the Devourer's prey. They're withdrawing, Admiral Chan reported from the Dimensional Defense Command Center.
The reality distortions are weakening. It's like they can't find what they're looking for.
Elena smiled, feeling the vast network of human consciousness that now spans star systems, all of it connected through quantum-entangled enhancement matrices that allowed instantaneous communication across interstellar distances.
Humanity had not just survived the crisis, it had evolved into something unprecedented.
But, the transformation was far from complete. The collective consciousness that humanity was becoming existed in constant tension with individual identity, requiring new forms of governance, new approaches to conflict resolution, and new ways of understanding personal relationships when individual minds could merge temporarily or permanently.
What happens now? President Walsh asked during the post-crisis debriefing.
We've changed ourselves to survive, but we're not the same species we were 6 months ago.
Elena consulted with the displaced collective and the growing network of enhanced human consciousness before answering.
Now we explore what it means to be a collective species in a universe full of other forms of consciousness. The Devourers were just one challenge. There are others, dimensional entities that might become allies, threats we haven't imagined yet, opportunities for growth and development that baseline humanity could never have accessed. She paused, feeling the vast potential of what humanity was becoming. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. We've destroyed our weakness as isolated individuals. What remains is to discover the strength of what we've become. Dr. Tanaka raised the question that many were thinking, do we still count as human? Elena considered this, her enhanced consciousness touching the minds of millions of people across human space, feeling their thoughts, dreams, and fears as they adapted to collective existence. We're more human than we've ever been, she said finally. We're what humanity always had the potential to become, not just individuals struggling against an indifferent universe, but a collective intelligence capable of shaping reality itself. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. Humanity had faced extinction and chosen evolution, destroying the weak, isolated consciousness that made them vulnerable and embracing a form of collective awareness that could defend itself against any threat. The renegade doctor who had refused to give up when traditional medicine failed had become the architect of humanity's transformation into something unprecedented in the known universe. As Elena stood in the assembly hall, surrounded by representatives of the species humanity had become, she reflected on the journey from desperate medical crisis to evolutionary breakthrough. The pathogen that had threatened to destroy human civilization had instead become the catalyst for humanity's transformation into something greater than the sum of its parts. The weak had been destroyed. What remained could never be destroyed by others, because it existed as a pattern of consciousness that transcended individual vulnerability. Humanity had become something new not through conquest or technology alone, but through the willingness to abandon limitations and embrace impossible possibilities. In the end, the greatest victory had come not from fighting the alien threat, but from joining with it, learning from it, and evolving beyond the forms of consciousness that had made humanity prey. The doctor who had refused to accept defeat had guided her species through its metamorphosis into something that could never again be defeated by forces beyond its control. The universe was vast and filled with challenges that baseline humanity could never have faced. But the collective consciousness that humanity had become was ready for whatever came next, armed not with weapons or shields, but with the ability to evolve, adapt, and transform in response to any threat or opportunity the cosmos might present. The weak self had been destroyed. What remained was limitless.